Europe in the early 1940s was a continent held together by fear, exhaustion, and violence. By the time the Second World War reached its midpoint, Nazi Germany controlled vast territories stretching from France to the edges of the Soviet Union. On maps, this empire looked solid and immovable. On the ground, it was anything but. The deeper German forces pushed into occupied lands, the more fragile their control became. Roads had to be guarded, railways protected, villages watched, forests searched. Every mile of territory required men, and by 1943 and 1944, Germany no longer had enough of them. Occupation was never just about soldiers and tanks. It was about psychology. German authority relied on the belief that resistance was pointless and deadly. Posters warned of executions. Hostages were taken. Entire villages were punished for the actions of one unseen fighter. The goal was simple: convince the population that survival depended on obedience. Yet these methods often produced the opposite effect. Fear bred hatred, and hatred turned into resistance. In forests, mountains, and city backstreets, underground movements formed, sometimes organized by governments in exile, sometimes born spontaneously from desperation. Resistance warfare did not look like traditional war. There were no front lines, no uniforms, no clear rules. Fighters lived double lives. A farmer by day might become a saboteur by night. A railway worker might quietly loosen bolts that would derail a supply train days later. These people were not soldiers in the conventional sense, but they were fighting for survival just as fiercely. They understood that open battle meant death. Their strength lay in invisibility, patience, and surprise. German rear area troops were tasked with crushing this invisible enemy. These units were often far from the glory of the front lines. They patrolled villages, guarded bridges, searched forests, and escorted prisoners. Many were older men or very young recruits. Others were wounded veterans pulled back from the front. Morale varied, but one thing was consistent: fatigue. Day after day, they faced an enemy they could not see, who struck without warning and vanished just as quickly. This constant tension wore them down. Soldiers became jumpy, suspicious, and sometimes callous. When nothing happened for weeks, discipline softened. Searches became quicker. Procedures were skipped. An unarmed man seemed less dangerous than a shadow in the trees. This was a dangerous assumption, but a human one. Occupation duty trained soldiers to expect fear and submission, not sudden, overwhelming violence from someone already in their grasp. The forests and rural regions of Eastern Europe were especially hostile to occupying forces. Dense terrain provided natural cover for resistance groups. Locals knew the land intimately, paths that never appeared on maps, hiding places passed down through generations, villages where silence was a form of protection. German patrols moved through these areas as outsiders. Every step carried uncertainty. Every encounter could be a trap. Resistance fighters learned to exploit this imbalance. They studied German routines, patrol timings, and reactions. They learned how soldiers searched prisoners, how close they stood, how quickly they relaxed once they believed a threat was neutralized. Training was often brutal and practical. There was little room for heroics. Fighters were taught that capture usually meant death, and that hesitation could cost not just their own lives but those of their comrades and families. This environment created people who thought differently about fate. Smiling when captured was not madness. It could be strategy. Calmness unsettled guards. It created confusion. It bought seconds. And in resistance warfare, seconds were everything. A delay of a few heartbeats could mean the difference between execution and escape, between silence and chaos. By 1944, the German war machine was cracking under pressure. Supply lines were overstretched. Communications broke down. Command structures became rigid, forcing units to follow routines even when those routines were dangerous. Rear area troops were told to maintain control at all costs, but they were given fewer resources to do so. This imbalance increased reliance on intimidation and routine rather than careful security. It was in this fragile space, between fear and overconfidence, that moments like the one at the center of this story became possible. Not because German soldiers were weak, but because occupation warfare eroded the safeguards that conventional armies rely on. It blurred the line between civilian and combatant. It turned routine into vulnerability. and it placed ordinary men on both sides into situations where a single decision could unleash unimaginable consequences. This was the world that produced the moment when a captured man could smile in the face of armed soldiers, and mean it. Not because he believed himself invincible, but because he understood the reality of the war around him. He knew that control was an illusion, that power could shift in an instant, and that history often turns not on grand strategies, but on quiet roads, tired soldiers, and a few seconds of absolute resolve. In such a world, legends were born easily, not from exaggeration alone, but from the raw, disorienting nature of events themselves. When violence erupted, it felt unreal, impossible to process. Survivors struggled to explain what they had seen. Numbers blurred. Time stretched and collapsed. And later, when the story was told and retold, it carried the weight of that shock. Understanding this context matters. Without it, the story becomes a fantasy of lone heroics. With it, the story becomes something more unsettling and more human. A reminder that war creates conditions where the unthinkable can happen, not because of destiny or myth, but because fear, fatigue, and preparation collided in a single, irreversible moment. He was not born a legend. Men like him rarely were. Before the war, he would have been ordinary in every visible way, someone whose name blended into village records or city registers, whose life followed familiar rhythms. War did not create extraordinary people, so much as it revealed what ordinary people could become when survival demanded it. By the time he stepped into the moment that would define him, he had already been shaped by years of occupation, loss, and constant danger. Resistance fighters were not recruited like soldiers in an army. There were no parade grounds, no uniforms, no clear ranks. Many were drawn in gradually. A favor asked. A message carried. A night spent hiding someone who could not be found. Each small act narrowed the path back to neutrality. Eventually, there came a point when turning away was no longer possible. By then, the resistance was not just a cause, it was a lifeline. Training, when it existed, was brief and mercilessly focused on reality. Resistance groups could not afford ideals that did not work. Every lesson had to keep someone alive or help kill the enemy quickly. Fighters learned how to move without being seen, how to listen for danger, how to read body language. They learned which mistakes got people captured and which mistakes got people killed. Above all, they learned that hesitation was fatal. Mental discipline mattered as much as physical skill. The most dangerous moment in resistance warfare was not the attack, it was the capture. Once taken alive, a fighter faced interrogation, torture, and execution. There would be no rescue, no prisoner exchange. Knowing this changed how resistance fighters thought about fear. Fear did not disappear, but it was controlled, compartmentalized. Panic was the enemy. Calm was a weapon. Some fighters trained themselves to appear harmless. They practiced slowing their breathing, relaxing their posture, softening their eyes. They learned how to make guards underestimate them. In occupied territories, German soldiers were trained to fear weapons, not composure. A calm prisoner did not fit the image of a threat. This mismatch between expectation and reality created opportunity. Smiling when captured was not an act of mockery. It was psychological warfare. A smile unsettled guards because it contradicted the script they expected to follow. Prisoners were supposed to plead, cry, or stare at the ground. A smile forced soldiers to reinterpret the situation, if only for a moment. That moment could be exploited. Resistance fighters were also trained to accept death. This acceptance was not romantic. It was brutally practical. A man who believed he was already dead could act without the hesitation that fear imposed. This mindset allowed fighters to take risks that seemed irrational to others. If escape failed, the outcome would be the same as compliance. This logic stripped capture of its power. The man at the center of this story had likely spent years living under false names, moving between safe houses, memoizing routes, and destroying anything that could link him to others if he were caught. He would have learned to carry himself like a civilian even when armed, to look empty-handed while being anything but. Weapons were chosen not for power, but for concealment and speed. Small pistols, easily hidden, easily drawn. Tools designed for moments measured in seconds. Close quarters, combat training emphasized instinct. There would be no time to think. No time to aim carefully. Fighters rehearsed movements until they became reflexive. Drawing a weapon, firing at close range, moving immediately to the next threat, these actions had to happen without conscious thought. In this way, violence became mechanical, almost detached. Emotion could come later, if at all. This detachment did not mean fighters were inhuman. Many carried deep guilt and trauma. They killed not because they wanted to, but because they believed the alternative was worse. Every German soldier they faced represented an occupying system that had already taken friends, family, and futures. The enemy was both personal and symbolic. This layered motivation fueled resolve. What separated experienced resistance fighters from novices was not courage, but preparation. Courage alone led to reckless death. Preparation created narrow paths to survival. The man who smiled when captured was not confident because he believed he would live. He was confident because he knew exactly what he would do next, regardless of the outcome. Stories of fighters who escaped impossible situations circulated quietly among resistance networks. These stories were not meant to glorify violence, but to teach. They demonstrated that gods made mistakes, that routines could be exploited, that the occupier's grip was not absolute. Each story sharpened the mindset of those still fighting. At the same time, these stories often grew in the telling. Memory under trauma is unreliable. Survivors miscounted seconds and bodies. Details blurred. But the core truth remained. Preparation could turn captivity into opportunity. The legend of a man killing 21 soldiers in under a minute mattered less than what it represented, a belief that even in the worst circumstances, action was possible. This belief sustained resistance movements long after individual fighters were gone. It kept people moving, hiding, striking, and surviving. The man himself may have vanished into anonymity or died shortly afterward, as so many did. His name may never be known with certainty. But his mindset, the disciplined calm, the acceptance of risk, the refusal to surrender psychologically, became part of a larger tradition. Understanding this man means understanding that he was not unique in spirit, only in circumstance. Thousands of resistance fighters carried the same training, the same mindset, the same willingness to act without hesitation. History remembers one moment because it was dramatic and shocking. But it was built on countless unseen moments of preparation, fear mastered through discipline, and ordinary people reshaped by an extraordinary war. The moment of capture rarely began with violence. It began with routine. A patrol moving through territory that had been declared secure. Boots on dirt roads. Rifles slung rather than raised. The unspoken belief that danger, if it existed at all, would announce itself loudly and from a distance. This was how occupying armies learned to survive the long hours between actual attacks. Constant alertness was impossible. Routine became a shield against exhaustion. When the patrol spotted him, there was nothing remarkable at first. A lone figure near the edge of the road, close enough to notice, far enough to raise suspicion. These encounters happened daily. Most ended with a brief questioning, sometimes a search, sometimes a beating, often nothing at all. The Germans had learned to categorize people quickly. Armed meant dangerous. Running meant guilt. Calm compliance suggested harmlessness. He did not run. That decision alone altered the dynamic. Running would have triggered instinctive fire. Compliance shifted the situation into procedure. Shouted orders. Hands raised. A slow approach with weapons ready but not aimed. The soldiers expected fear. They expected submission. What they did not expect was composure. He stood still as they closed in. His posture relaxed, shoulders low, breathing steady. These details mattered. Soldiers trained to read threat cues subconsciously. Tension, sudden movement, clenched fists, these triggered reactions. His calm disarmed them in a way no gesture of surrender ever could. The search was hurried. Not because the soldiers were callous, but because they believed they already understood what they were dealing with. Occupation duty rewarded speed, not thoroughness. The faster a patrol moved, the less time it spent exposed. A quick pat-down. A glance at his pockets. No rifle. No visible explosives. Enough to confirm their assumptions. They bound his hands loosely. This was common. Tight binding slowed movement and required attention. A compliant prisoner did not seem worth the effort. He was placed among them rather than isolated. Again, routine overruled caution. The smile came then. It was not wide, not mocking, just enough to be noticed, enough to disrupt expectations. Smiles in wartime were unsettling because they did not belong. One soldier reportedly laughed it off, interpreting it as nervousness or defiance. Another found it irritating. None interpreted it as a warning. At this point, the patrol believed the danger had passed. Their attention fragmented. Some soldiers looked outward, scanning the tree line. Others focused on conversation, on the next destination, on how soon the patrol would end. This diffusion of focus was subtle, almost invisible, but it was decisive. The man observed everything. Distances, angles, who stood closest, whose weapon was slung, who was looking away. This was not improvisation. It was assessment under pressure. Training transformed panic into analysis. His body remained still, but his mind was active, measuring time in heartbeats. This phase, seconds before chaos, is often overlooked in retellings. Violence is easier to describe than anticipation. Yet anticipation is where outcomes are decided. Once the first shot is fired, events cascade beyond control. Before that, everything rests on choice. The German soldiers made another critical assumption, that danger required coordination. That an attack would involve multiple fighters, a signal, an ambush. They did not consider that a single man, already in their custody, could initiate overwhelming violence. This assumption was shaped by conventional military thinking. Resistance warfare thrived on violating those assumptions. He waited. Not long. Just long enough. The patrol shifted position slightly. A soldier stepped closer. Another turned his head. A weapon strap loosened as someone adjusted their stance. These micro-movements created gaps. The opening was not dramatic. It rarely is. It was simply there, and it would close quickly. In that instant, the situation transformed. What had been a prisoner under guard became a man with a plan. What had been control became illusion. The Germans still believed they were managing the encounter. They were wrong, but they had not yet realized it. This moment was irreversible. Once he committed, there would be no retreat, no negotiation, no second chance. If he hesitated, he would die. If he acted, he might still die, but he would do so on his own terms. This is the reality behind the legend. Not a sudden explosion of action, but a quiet convergence of fatigue, routine, training, and psychology. Each side believed it understood the situation. Only one of them truly did. When history remembers moments like this, it often collapses them into spectacle. But the truth lies in these silent seconds, when nothing appears to happen, and everything is already decided. The moment he acted was sudden, but it was also inevitable. The 45 seconds that followed were a combination of preparation, opportunity, and the human reaction to shock. Close-quarters combat is a world of milliseconds, where reflexes often outweigh conscious thought. What ordinary observers see as chaos is often highly structured in the mind of a trained fighter. Every movement is calculated, every breath timed, every threat prioritized. He drew his first pistol as naturally as a man might open a door. The weapon had been concealed beneath layers of clothing, invisible to the rushed search, invisible because the human eye is trained to see what it expects. Soldiers trained to identify obvious threats fail when danger is subtle, when it doesn't match the template stored in their minds. At such close range, a small weapon becomes devastating. The first soldier who turned toward him barely had time to register the movement before he was down. The instant shock froze others in place, a momentary paralysis that would prove fatal. The second shot followed immediately. There was no hesitation, no dramatic pause, no opportunity for negotiation. He moved systematically, stepping into angles that reduced the chance of being struck, positioning himself so that each new threat could be addressed with the efficiency of rehearsed motion. In close-quarters combat, movement is as important as marksmanship. Fighters are taught to occupy space in ways that maximize control while minimizing exposure. This was no improvisation. It was discipline manifested under extreme pressure. Chaos unfolded among the soldiers. Shouts overlapped with the sounds of falling bodies and gunfire. Some soldiers instinctively reached for weapons slung on their shoulders, only to find they could not draw them in time. Others tripped over companions or obstacles, adding to the confusion. Panic is contagious. In these few seconds, the trained coherence of a patrol collapsed. Every mistake was amplified, every delay exploited. The human mind is poorly equipped to respond rationally to sudden, unpredictable violence, especially when it comes from someone previously assumed to be harmless. The psychological impact on the remaining soldiers was profound. They had been taught that compliance meant safety, that routine and procedure were sufficient shields. That belief had been shattered in less than a minute. The shock of seeing comrades fall so quickly, and at the hands of a man who had seemed harmless, created a momentary paralysis that prevented coordinated counteraction. Some soldiers fled instinctively. Others froze, unable to comprehend the sequence of events. In these moments, fear became both weapon and shield, defining behavior as much as bullets did. Weapon concealment played a crucial role. Small pistols allowed for rapid deployment and close-range lethality. Larger firearms would have been unwieldy in such tight quarters. The choice of weapons, combined with knowledge of the enemy's expectations, allowed the man to operate with disproportionate effect. He did not rely on luck. He relied on the physics of space, reaction times, and human cognition under stress. The environment, the narrow clearing, the distribution of soldiers, their orientation, was as much a factor as his actions. Understanding the battlefield, even in miniature, is essential to understanding how 45 seconds could produce such an outcome. Historical parallels exist in other resistance and guerrilla operations. Urban ambushes during the Warsaw Uprising, partisan raids in the forests of Belarus, and small-scale commando operations elsewhere in Europe often resulted in similarly disproportionate casualties. Close-range engagements favor preparation and initiative. The element of surprise, when combined with trained reflexes, creates opportunities for extraordinary results. The legend of a single fighter inflicting heavy losses in under a minute is rare, but not implausible. The conditions of occupation warfare, the fatigue of troops, overconfidence, environmental advantage, make the improbable possible. Timing was everything. In close combat, hesitation is deadly. The man's training ensured that once he decided to act, every movement was automatic. Muscle memory took over. Cognitive delays that might have killed an untrained person were absent. Each shot, each step, each decision flowed naturally. The difference between hesitation and action in these scenarios is often measured in milliseconds, but those milliseconds determine life or death. In this case, they allowed him to neutralize multiple threats before the enemy could regroup. Even the surviving German soldier experienced the psychological effects of what happened. Witnessing an event of such rapid and unexpected violence can create lasting trauma. Memories blur, time seems to slow, and the mind struggles to process what it saw. These human reactions are critical to understanding how and why the engagement unfolded as it did. It was not only the man's actions that defined the outcome, but also the soldier's inability to process and respond in time. Human psychology, more than physical skill alone, shaped the battlefield. Ultimately, this episode illustrates the intersection of preparation, opportunity, and human limitation. The man had the training and the mindset. The soldiers had the fatigue and the assumptions. The environment provided the conditions. When all these factors converged, 45 seconds became a transformative, deadly moment. The event is remembered not only for its violence but for what it reveals about resistance warfare, human reaction under stress, and the fragile illusion of control in occupied territories. In these seconds, history was made, not by grand strategy, but by individual action executed with precision under the pressures of war. The aftermath of those 45 seconds was as consequential psychologically as it was physically. For the German forces, the incident was more than a numerical loss. It shattered the sense of control that occupation soldiers had relied upon for months or years. The routine of patrolling, searching, and interrogating depended on predictability, on the belief that captives were compliant, that civilians obeyed orders, and that threats were obvious. This event exposed the fragility of that assumption. The image of a man, unarmed at first glance, smiling calmly before unleashing deadly force, was impossible to reconcile with the mental templates of soldiers trained to categorize threats quickly. That cognitive dissonance left its mark. Reports of the incident spread quietly at first among units, whispered in mess halls, repeated in letters, and occasionally recorded in after-action logs. Even those who had not witnessed it felt the tension. Fear is contagious in an army, particularly when faced with an enemy who operates outside the rules. For the resistance, the story became symbolic. Whether or not every detail was accurate, it illustrated a core truth. The occupiers were not invincible. A single, prepared, disciplined individual could exploit weaknesses, strike decisively, and escape, or at least survive long enough to continue the fight. Tales like this reinforced morale, both among fighters and civilians who supported them. They served as proof that the human spirit, when combined with training and courage, could impose meaningful consequences on a far larger and better equipped force. It also contributed to the psychological warfare of the resistance. Occupying soldiers who had heard or seen the story became more paranoid, less confident, and more prone to overreaction. Each patrol into forests, villages, or abandoned farms carried the shadow of what had happened. The enemy's fear became a strategic advantage. Yet there is also the tension between myth and historical fact. Human memory is fallible, especially under extreme stress. Survivors often misremember numbers, durations, or sequences of events. What is told as 45 seconds and 21 soldiers might have been slightly longer or shorter, slightly more or less deadly. Trauma compresses and distorts time. Stories are polished by retelling, emphasizing drama to ensure they are remembered. Historians must navigate this carefully, extracting truth from legend without diminishing the impact. Even when specific details are uncertain, the story illustrates enduring principles of resistance warfare, preparation, initiative, and the exploitation of enemy assumptions. The incident also underscores the role of individual agency in war. Much of history focuses on armies, generals, and strategies, but moments like these remind us that outcomes are not determined solely by size or firepower. Individual actions, informed by skill, courage, and situational awareness, can tip the balance in unexpected ways. In a conflict as large and devastating as World War II, these small, decisive moments ripple outward. They affect enemy behavior, influence morale, and inspire subsequent actions. One person's training and composure became a catalyst for broader consequences, illustrating how human factors intertwine with historical forces. Finally, the story endures because it represents a universal truth about conflict and courage. It reminds us that war is not only fought with armies, but with human choices made under extreme pressure. It highlights the interplay between fear and action, preparation and opportunity, assumption and reality. Even decades later, such episodes compel us to examine the conditions that allow individuals to act decisively, and the human cost of both success and failure. The lesson is subtle but powerful. History is shaped not only by the grand strategies recorded in books, but also by fleeting moments of insight, courage, and action that leave an indelible mark on those who witness them. In reflecting on this episode, one sees the complexity of legacy. Legends are built on facts, and facts are colored by perception. The man's smile, the seconds of chaos, the resulting deaths, all have been interpreted and reinterpreted over time. Yet their enduring significance lies less in exact numbers than in what they reveal about human resilience, psychological warfare, and the capacity for decisive action under unimaginable pressure. The echoes of that moment shaped not only immediate tactical decisions, but also the broader understanding of resistance in occupied territories. Stories like this, whether mythic or factual, continue to captivate because they distill the essence of human courage into a single, unforgettable episode. They remind us that in history, as in life, the extraordinary often arises from the ordinary, and that individual choices, however fleeting, can reverberate through time.